He sat quietly in the corner of the Marine training facility, just an old man with coffee and worn boots that nobody noticed. The young recruits joked about the grandpa watching their drills until he stepped onto the firing line and shattered the Force Recon accuracy record that had stood for 12 years. Because Thomas Mitchell wasn't just watching, he was the legend who set that record in the first place. Welcome to Secrets Never Told. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about hidden strength and unexpected recognition, subscribe for more content that reveals the power of those who stand in silence. The morning mist clung to Camp Pendleton like a familiar ghost, wrapping around the concrete buildings and chain-link fences that defined the Marine Corps training facility. Thomas Mitchell arrived at exactly 0630 hours, same as he had every Tuesday for the past 3 months. He carried a dented steel thermos filled with black coffee and wore the same faded red flannel shirt that had seen better decades. At 67, Thomas moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body remembered things his mind tried to forget. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent a lifetime gripping weapons in places that didn't appear on maps. But to the young Marines filtering into the facility for morning drills, he was just another old man with nowhere else to be. "There's Grandpa again," muttered Private First Class Danny Rodriguez as he shouldered his M4 carbine. At 19, Rodriguez carried himself with the cocky confidence that came from surviving basic training and thinking he knew what being a Marine meant. "Probably lives in his car," laughed Corporal Jake Stevens, adjusting his gear with the swagger of someone who'd made it through his first deployment to a relatively quiet sector in Jordan. "Comes here for the entertainment." Thomas settled onto the wooden bleachers overlooking the firing range, unscrewing his thermos with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. The steam rose from his coffee like incense, and he took a slow sip while watching the Marines set up their equipment. He didn't check his phone, didn't make conversation with anyone. He just watched. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez began the morning briefing, her voice cutting through the coastal fog with the authority of someone who'd earned her stripes in Fallujah. "Today, we're running precision drills at 100, 200, and 300 yards. Prone position, supported. Each Marine gets 20 rounds. We're looking for consistency, not hero shots." The Marines nodded, some checking their scopes, others practicing their breathing techniques. This was their 3rd week of advanced marksmanship training, and most of them were starting to feel confident about their abilities. They'd moved past the fundamentals and were beginning to think they might actually be pretty good at this shooting thing. Thomas watched them with eyes that had seen the same eager confidence in other young faces, in places like Beirut and Mogadishu and the mountains of Afghanistan. He recognized the telltale signs, the unnecessary adjustments to equipment that was already properly set, the exaggerated breathing exercises, the way they glanced around to see who might be watching their performance. The first group took their positions. 20 Marines spread across the firing line, settling into prone positions behind their rifles. The targets downrange looked deceptively close at 100 yards, but Thomas knew that confidence and competence were two very different things. "Firing line is hot," Gonzalez announced. "Commence firing when ready." The range erupted with the controlled chaos of semi-automatic fire. Some Marines found their rhythm immediately, others struggled with their positioning. Thomas watched without expression as Rodriguez rushed his shots, eager to prove something to his peers. He watched Stevens overcorrect his breathing and jerk his trigger. He watched 24 young men and women learning lessons that couldn't be taught in a classroom. When the smoke cleared and targets were scored, the results were predictably mixed. A few Marines had shot respectable groups. Most had scattered their rounds across the target like buckshot. Rodriguez had missed the target entirely on 3 shots. "Better," Gonzalez called out diplomatically. "But we've got work to do." As the Marines moved to the 200-yard line, Rodriguez's frustration began to show. He adjusted his scope unnecessarily, changed his cheek weld 3 times, and muttered complaints about the wind that was barely strong enough to move the flags. "This is bullshit," he said loud enough for his buddies to hear. "These targets are too small. In combat, you're not shooting at paper dots." Thomas's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his thermos. In his experience, the Marines who complained the loudest about training were usually the ones who folded fastest when things got real. But he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some lessons had to be lived rather than taught. The 200-yard shooting went worse. The increased distance exposed every flaw in technique, every shortcut in training. Rodriguez managed to hit the target, but nowhere near the center. Stevens did better, but still struggled with consistency. A few Marines performed well, but but the overall results would have been embarrassing if anyone important had been watching. Except someone important was watching. Thomas Mitchell had forgotten more about precision shooting than most of these Marines would ever learn. He'd set records that still stood in books these young men would never see. He'd made shots in combat that had saved lives and changed the outcome of operations that remained classified decades later. But to them, he was just an old man with coffee who had nothing better to do with his Tuesday mornings. As the Marines prepared for the 300-yard challenge, Rodriguez's frustration boiled over. He'd missed the target completely on his first shot and was struggling to even find the paper with his scope. "This is impossible," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Nobody can shoot that accurately at this distance with iron sights." "We're using scopes, dipshit," Stevens pointed out. "Whatever," Rodriguez snapped back. "I bet half the instructors couldn't hit those targets consistently." That's when Thomas Mitchell made a decision that would change the trajectory of every person on that range. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting after sitting in the same position for 2 hours, and began walking toward the firing line. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez noticed him first. "Sir, this is a restricted area. Only authorized personnel—" "I know," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the understated authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mind if I give it a try?" Gonzalez looked uncertain. Protocol said civilians weren't allowed on the firing line, but something in the old man's demeanor made her hesitate. Rodriguez, sensing an opportunity for entertainment, jumped in. "Hell yeah, old-timer. Show us how it's done." He stepped back from his rifle with an exaggerated bow. "All yours, Grandpa." Thomas approached the firing line with steps that seemed to grow steadier with each pace. He knelt beside Rodriguez's rifle, examining the setup with professional interest. The weapon was properly zeroed, the scope was correctly mounted, and the ammunition was standard issue M855 ball. "What's the current record for this course?" Thomas asked Gonzalez. "Unofficial record is all 20 rounds in the 10 ring at 300 yards, she replied. "Set 12 years ago. Nobody's come close since." Thomas nodded once, then settled into position behind the rifle. His movements were economical, practiced, automatic. He didn't adjust the scope, didn't change the stock position, didn't make any of the fussy modifications the Marines had been making all morning. He simply became one with the weapon in a way that spoke of thousands of hours of practice and dozens of life-and-death situations where a missed shot meant disaster. The range fell quiet. Even Rodriguez stopped talking, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Thomas controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle, and found that perfect moment between heartbeats where the world becomes still. The first shot surprised everyone, including Thomas. The rifle cracked once, and 300 yards downrange, the target showed a perfect hit in the center ring. No big deal. Good Marines made that shot regularly. But then Thomas kept shooting. Not fast, not rushed, but with a rhythm that spoke of absolute confidence. Each shot came at exactly the same interval. Each trigger pull was identical to the last. Each follow-through was mechanically perfect. There was no drama, no showmanship, just surgical precision applied to the art of marksmanship. Shot after shot landed in the 10 ring. Not scattered around the center, but grouped so tightly that the holes began to overlap. Thomas wasn't just hitting the target, he was essentially shooting the same hole 20 times. By the 10th shot, every Marine on the range had stopped what they were doing to watch. By the 15th shot, instructors were gathering behind the firing line. By the 20th shot, even the range officer had come down from his tower to witness what was happening. When Thomas set the rifle down and stepped back from the line, the range was so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the target frames. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez activated the electronic target system, and the results appeared on the screen visible to everyone present. 20 shots, 20 hits, all within a circle smaller than a quarter. Not only had Thomas broken the 12-year-old record, he'd obliterated it in a way that would likely never be matched. Rodriguez stared at the screen, his mouth open, all his earlier bravado evaporated. Stevens removed his cover and scratched his head in disbelief. Even the instructors exchanged glances that mixed respect with confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Gonzalez asked. Thomas Mitchell picked up his thermos, took a sip of coffee that had gone cold while he was shooting, and looked out at the target still swaying in the breeze. "Just someone who remembers when this meant something," he said quietly. That's when Gonzalez noticed the faded tattoo on Thomas's forearm, a Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor, but with additional markings that indicated special operations. "Force Recon. You're him," she said, recognition dawning in her voice. "You're the Raven." Thomas didn't confirm or deny it. He simply nodded to the Marines who were still staring at him with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, then began walking back toward the bleachers. But Rodriguez wasn't done. The humiliation of being shown up so thoroughly by an old man had triggered something defensive in his young ego. "So what?" he called out. "That was just one good day. Probably beginner's luck." Thomas stopped walking. For a moment, he stood with his back to the Marines, and everyone on the range held their breath. When he finally turned around, his expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of experience that couldn't be faked. "Son," he said, his voice carrying across the range despite its quiet tone, "I've had nothing but good days for the past 47 years, and today wasn't about luck." The silence that followed stretched on until Staff Sergeant Gonzalez finally cleared her throat and announced that the day's training was concluded. Marines began packing their equipment with unusual quietness, stealing glances at the old man who had just redefined their understanding of what marksmanship could look like. As Thomas walked back to his pickup truck in the parking lot, he could hear whispered conversations starting behind him. Within an hour, everyone on the base would know what had happened. Within a day, the story would spread to other Marine installations. Within a week, it would become legend. But Thomas Mitchell, the man they called Raven, didn't stick around to hear any of it. He had made his point, delivered his lesson, and reminded a new generation of Marines that skill and experience never really fade. They just wait for the right moment to resurface. As he drove away from Camp Pendleton, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, on a ridge overlooking a valley where American lives had hung in the balance, a much younger version of himself had made shots that were even more impossible than what he just demonstrated. The difference was that those shots had no witnesses except the enemy combatants who never lived to tell about them. Today's performance had been for show. Those shots in Afghanistan had been for keeps. And that, Thomas reflected as he headed home to his quiet house and his quiet retirement, was a distinction these young Marines would hopefully never have to learn firsthand.